Yeah, this next installment of this lecture series looks at culturally defined Indians. In the last installment, we talked briefly about legally defined and biologically defined. And so this section is going to be looking at the culturally defined Indians. And so, how do cultural definitions impact Indians? Or what are the cultural markers one would use to define if someone or if a tribe is to be considered Indian? So, some examples that I've had in class in the past is people say, well, somebody speaking the tribal language is a good cultural marker. Wearing traditional dress, wearing the tribal dress, is a good cultural marker. And we know people who speak the language fluently. We know people who wear their Indian clothes all the time. We know that people who participate in tribal activities, whether it's the sacred or the secular, we know people participate in the tribal activities. Eating traditional foods is another way of one of those identifying how people would be considered or a tribe would be considered Indian. And we know that there are many, many other ways, many, many more ways that we would look at a person as being culturally Indian. And so that seems pretty cut and dried, that's just kind of the way it is. And these cultural markers seem to be reasonable, but let's take a look at some other options. What if a person always wears their tribal clothes, but they got this thing that they eat at McDonald's every morning for breakfast, or maybe even a couple of times a day? Is that person an Indian? What if a person speaks their language, but because of work and distance cannot participate in tribal activities? They just kind of speak their language out there all by themselves. What if a person lives in a tribal community but doesn't speak the language? Is that person still an Indian? And what about the person who grew up in the city? Maybe their grandparents had moved to the city because of relocation. So they're a second generation urban Indian. Their parents were the first generation and they're the second generation. And they only go home once a year. And what do they do when they're there? Do they participate or in the tribal activities, or they just kind of go around and visit friends and family? And so we see that culturally defined Indians, it's not so easy. And one of the reasons I threw out this thing on McDonald's is there was a tribe in Canada that was petitioning the Canadian government for recognition as a tribe, and they were denied because they went into town and ate at McDonald's and bought Western clothing. And the government of Canada decided that they were not native or not native enough to be considered Indian as a tribe. And so these cultural markers, seems like we can lay these things out. In fact, I have this thing I've done in the face-to-face class where I have everybody, okay, how many people here raise your hand if you speak your language? Okay, so then there's a group, maybe a third of the class, and then I said, okay, nobody else. If you don't speak your language, you can't play anymore. Then how many of you, have eaten traditional foods in the last 2 weeks? And then of course, a bunch of hands go down. So we end up with only a couple of people who fit all of the cultural markers. And so this could be a very, very dangerous way of identifying who's Indian. And that happens on the individual level, but it also happens on the tribal level as well. And there's three cases that are really, really important in this cultural definition of Indian, and they all affect the Pueblo Indians of New Mexico. They're all based in Pueblo villages, and right around the turn of the 19th and 20th century, all these cases occurred between 1880 and 1920. Two of the cases were land encroachment cases, United States versus Lucero and United States versus Joseph. One was in Taos Pueblo and one was in, I believe it was Cochiti Pueblo. And people had basically moved on to Indian land. And the question was, they'd moved on to the lands of the Pueblo. There were squatters who had decided they just wanted to have some land, and they set up shop and took over some land. If they had done that on the federal reservation, there were very specific protections for tribes under federal jurisdiction. But there was a question of whether the Pueblos were Indians. And the Pueblos' relationship with the United States government is determined largely by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which is a treaty that was signed at the end of the Mexican War because the Pueblos were under the jurisdiction of Mexico, and when the United States invaded the American Southwest and took this land from Mexico, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo recognized, ended the war, but it also recognized the rights of the tribes, but it didn't necessarily give those Pueblos the same kind of protection against encroachment as tribes that had treaties and other federal laws applying to them. The other question was whether you can introduce liquor. Of course, we all know there's a period of time when you couldn't have liquor on reservations, and still for a lot of reservations that's still true. There's still a lot of dry reservations. And the question is whether introduction of liquor at San Juan Pueblo could be prevented under federal law, and that was the Sandoval case. So all three of these cases are tied together at determining whether Pueblo Indians are Indians or not. And whether, again, all three are based on whether Pueblo communities and lands are considered Indian land or Indian country. And ultimately, all three of them were decided on whether they're Indian land based on the cultural definition of what an Indian person is. And I guess this is the real kind of scary part, is that in the 1880s, the popular culture idea of what an Indian was were Sioux Indians or Plains Indians, Indians who loved, quote, the chase, who were sent to reservations, who were basically starving on reservations, and whose traditional economy had been destroyed. But the American view of an Indian was this kind of bloodthirsty savage, out to, don't live in villages, don't farm, you chase buffalo all day and all that. But that's just the opposite of how Pueblo people live. They lived in villages. They lived in, villages. They'd been in this. Those villages were in this land for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years before the arrival of the Europeans. They practiced agriculture. They weren't off out living their whole existence on the chase as Americans envisioned Indians to be doing. And each of these cases overruled each other. The first decision was that yes, they were Indians. The second one said no, they're not Indians because they live in villages and they farm. Culturally, they're not Indians. And then the last case, the Sandoval case, finally decided yes, Pueblo Indians are Indians. And it's kind of interesting. The reason that they did that, this case, the last case came out in the early, I think, 1920s or so. And by that time, enough non-Indians had moved into the communities, and the Pueblos were still speaking their language, refusing to send their children to school, and practicing their own tribal religion, to the exclusion, to a large degree, of American missionaries. And that was ultimately the basis as why they were considered Indian. And so you see the United States government, the United States Supreme Court, these are all United States Supreme Court cases, can't make up its mind because they're trying to identify what an Indian is from the perspective of culture. And of course, the Americans had their idea of what an Indian was and what their culture was and what it should be. And here are these Pueblo people who are indigenous, have been here in the Southwest for thousands of years, and there was confusion as to whether they're Indians or not. And so this idea of culturally defined Indians becomes a very, very controversial type thing, because you do end up with trying to figure out who is or who isn't by their actions. But the real question in terms of a culturally defined Indian is who determines what the cultural markers that define Indian are. In this case, in these three cases coming out of the Pueblo countries at the turn of the century, those cultural markers were determined by the United States Supreme Court. And we see that cultural marker in Canada with the tribe in British Columbia who was petitioning to be recognized as a tribe. The cultural marker was determined by the Canadian government. And so it's very, very easy for people to say, oh, this is what an Indian is because this is what we expect them to do because of popular culture. Whereas the tribe itself is saying, we have our beliefs, we have our way of life. We do things the way we do based on our traditions and our stories and all of these kinds of things. Who is anybody else to say that we are not who we are? But this is really the big issue in terms of culturally defined Indians.